Good morning from Washington, D.C. This is Beatriz Garcia Nice, Gender-Based Violence Project Lead here at the Wilson Center. I am thrilled to welcome everyone to this event, the launch of our publication, Pathways to Justice, Gender-Based Violence and the Rule of Law, with this fantastic panel. I want to especially thank our co-sponsors, the George W. Bush Institute and Women in International Security for their support, as well as the Latin American Program, our Asia Program, Middle East Program, Maternal Health Initiative, and the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center. A special mention and thanks goes to Anya Prusa, Olivia Soledad, and Caroline Matawaran for their tremendous work. Gender-based violence affects 1 in 3 women worldwide. Many countries around the world have passed legislation intended to protect women from violence, yet violence persists. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic only exacerbated gender-based violence, what has come to be known as the shadow pandemic, aggravating risk factors while increasing barriers to protection, support, and justice. Every day, approximately 137 women and girls are killed by a family member or intimate partner. In India, dowry-related killings result in 20 femicides per day, with nearly 7,000 dowry deaths in 2020. In Honduras, between January and July of this year, 235 women were killed, but of those, only 174 were treated as crimes of femicide. And here, close to home in the United States, 3 women are murdered every day by current or former partners. There is, however, one positive outcome from this ongoing pandemic, and it is that it brought to the forefront women's issues and the lack of effective legislation and public policies to face this challenge. To explore these issues, the Wilson Center is launching today, under the umbrella of the 16 Days campaign against gender-based violence, an edited report focused on the intersection of gender-based violence and the rule of law. This compilation examines how legal frameworks, judicial system responses, and public policies contribute to the ways in which gender-based violence is and is not addressed around the world. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel of experts in the field from 4 regions. Natalie Gonella-Platz, Director of the Women's Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute, who co-authored the piece, No Justice, Gender-Based Violence and Migration in Central America. Mushira Khattab, former Minister of Family and Populations in Egypt, who authored Criminalization of Gender-Based Violence, a Legal Obligation in the MENA region. Mariana Muravieva, Professor of Russian Law at the University of Helsinki, who will discuss Russia's gender-based violence legislation and who authored the piece, Domestic Violence Legislation in Russia, Campaigning for Change. And finally, Hari Seshatai, a global fellow with us here at the Wilson Center, who authored the piece, Addressing the Historical Roots of Gender-Based Violence in 21st Century India. Without further ado, we will have introductory remarks by Ariela Blatter, the President of Women in International Security. Ariela.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to participate in this important launch event representing women in international security. WISE is a global organization dedicated to the advancement of women's leadership and achieving gender equality in international peace and security. We're proud to partner with the Wilson Center on the 16 Days of Activism against Gender-Based Violence. I'd like to particularly thank the Wilson Center and Beatriz for leading this critical project, as well as the George W. Bush Institute and esteemed panelists. And as you heard today, our distinguished panelists will be discussing their research on addressing gender-based violence and the rule of law in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. And as Beatriz and many of the authors have pointed out, gender-based violence is an appallingly common problem, with 1 in 3 women affected globally. And we'd seen lagging progress in prevention and accountability for gender-based violence before the arrival of the shadow pandemic for women and girls. And the pandemic has increased risk factors for gender-based violence, making it more difficult to access support services and legal protections. But that statistic that we quote, the 1 in 3, has been amended recently by UN Women, who now estimates that nearly 1 out of 2 women have been exposed to violence since the onset of the pandemic. And the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index indicates that closing the gender gap has now increased by more than 35 years. In addition, we know that gender-based violence occurs across race, class, and other structural barriers. And it is prevalent in Central and Latin America, as noted by panelists Natalie Gonella-Platz in her report. Natalie and her co-authors identify weak institutions, corruption, and impunity for perpetrators as aggravating the problem of gender-based violence in the Northern Triangle. As noted in the research, the lack of enforcement and access to justice for women and girls across the Triangle has been a push factor driving the asylum crisis in the US southern border. And gender-based violence remains a serious concern throughout Russia and the MENA region. Panelist Mariana Muraveva discusses the challenges of passing legislation to prevent domestic and intimate partner violence in Russia. Mariana, I hope I did justice by your surname. And panelist Mushira Khattab notes the gains in gender advancements and equality that have accelerated in MENA since the Arab Spring. However, as armed conflict persists in the region, FGM, rape, domestic and intimate partner violence have similarly increased. And finally, panelist Ari Seshasai points to the problematic and prevalent gender norms in India that have always existed, noting that as many as 2/3 of men in India believe there are times when a woman deserves to be beaten. Yet, as Ari notes, it does not have to remain this way. To dismantle patriarchy and guarantee women's right to safety and self-determination, we have to have a movement, and also where men must play an integral part in the struggle for gender inequality. And further, gender equality is a concept that must be shared by those in judicial, political, and law enforcement institutions. I know that we intend to finish on a positive note today. And here I'm also reminded of the relevant recent research by Dr. Valerie Hudson, making the data-grounded case that while social and political structures have long been used to oppress women, changes to laws, practices, and customs that subordinate women will improve outcomes for all. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to this important conversation.
Thank you so much, Ariela. You make excellent points. And we have a little over 15 minutes to talk about all of these issues. We're going to do 3 rounds, as I mentioned. First, we're going to talk about the background and the current situation of your regions or countries. Then we're going to move on to institutions. And we're going to end on a positive note, as Ariela noticed, with solutions. So Mariana, I would like to start with you. And you mentioned in your piece that domestic violence, including intimate partner violence, is not officially considered a violation of human rights in Russia. How is this possible? How is this managed in Russia right now?
Okay, yes, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very important event. I'm actually thrilled to be able to share my research and to talk about issues and challenges that we have in Eurasia, as Russia is actually right in the middle of 2 very important geographical parts, right, Europe and Asia. And there's a lot of theorizing that the problems Russia might have is exactly due to its hybrid regime, hybrid geography, hybrid everything. Anyway, as you've mentioned, and one of the most problematic situations today is that human rights of women are not understood as including gender-based violence, although the awareness of that, of course, is much higher than it used to be 10, 15 years ago. That is, of course, historically explainable, and that goes back to the Soviet framing of human rights of women, as well as the Soviet framing of such issues as domestic violence. Just to give you a sort of 30 seconds of introduction into sort of crash course into human rights of women. Now, in the Soviet Union, so gender equality was an official agenda for the Communist Party. And we cannot forget that. So Soviet women actually got quite a good deal out of communist ideas on equality. Well, the problem was, of course, that was egalitarian equality, the equality that wasn't understood as equality of situations, right? Substantive equality, as we call it today. It was understood as sameness. So everybody's the same, therefore everybody has the same rights, which, as you can imagine, is not how we sort of think about equality today. But the Soviet Union had a completely different agenda and a completely different understanding of what people are supposed to do. And of course, Soviet Union was very focused on this goal to create a communist future, whatever sort of attitudes we have to it. So it's positive or negative, that's irrelevant now. So domestic violence was not something that Communist Party or the Soviet Union wanted to acknowledge, because basically domestic violence pointed out that they couldn't overcome the equality, discrimination, that they couldn't actually create this equality in a sense that women continued to be abused by their partners. And as in a tradition of the other Soviet sort of style of problem solving, they just basically relegated it into the issue of social problems. So there are some problems with the Soviet regime, and domestic violence is this minor problem we have to overcome. It's serious, yes, but we can do that. And therefore, domestic violence was always considered to be as this part of sort of social problem solving once we eliminate alcohol and illiteracy and issues like poverty, which again are not supposed to happen in a Soviet regime. We'll be okay. Well, I would like to say that it's very Soviet, but it's actually not. So if you look historically back to other countries, obviously domestic violence was always viewed, even in Europe, as a social problem, like alcohol or illiteracy or poverty or different class. So, but unfortunately, the 90s they inherited that. And because they inherited that, and also there was no a positive reflection or a thoughtful reflection in the Soviet past, sort of domestic violence continued to be a social problem. And therefore the institutions, the legislation, the society's attitude remained as such. In the past 20 years, there's also emergence of the idea that domestic violence is a private problem, right? So there's a private sphere of the family, and this is somewhere there. And in a public sphere, domestic violence is not a problem because it's not a threat to the public. And of course, this is a very old feminist criticism of how domestic violence was framed. Therefore, Russia ended up today as this post-socialist state with these two very classic approaches, old classic approaches to domestic violence, as if we're still back 50 years, right? So one of this is a social problem, and the other one is a private problem that has nothing to do with a public danger. So domestic violence is not a danger to the public because basically men abuse their women in private, and they usually don't turn against anybody in the public. Which changed again in the past 5 years, but we'll probably talk about it in a positive note, that there's a different framing. So therefore, the debate today is between the feminist and women's movement who try to introduce the human rights discourse to the government and persuade the officials that this is a human rights problem. And as Russian state is participant to international treaties and international law, Russia has an obligation to protect human rights, including human rights of women, right? Being a party to CEDAW Convention and everything else, not though to Istanbul Convention, but that's a different story, right? And there is this opposing discourse of the conservative and sort of nationalistic organizations. They tend to use cultural sovereignty framework, saying that Russia is this very specific country. You can't really come with this human rights discourse. Look, we've been solving this problem for a long time, and it's not really a human rights problem. That's a problem of intervention into the family. And once the state interferes, that is not good. It's like in Soviet times, although it's not like in Soviet times, right? So you have that conundrum. And of course, it's very difficult to promote protectionist and the human rights legislation in this situation.
Wow, it was a very interesting crash course, Mariana, and definitely, problem that needs to be very visible right now in Russia.
Sure, absolutely.
Natalie, I'm gonna turn to you and as many of us know, from the 25 most dangerous countries in the world for women right now, 10 are here in the Western Hemisphere, and Central America has 2 of them, Honduras and El Salvador being 2 and 4 respectively. What are the shortcomings we see with legislation from Northern Triangle countries that contribute to the asylum crisis at the US southern border?
Thank you, Beatrice. And first and foremost, I have to thank the Wilson Center and my fellow panelists for just your incredible advocacy and not only putting together this panel, but also the report. It's really fantastic. And in terms of the Northern Triangle, when looking at the issue of gender-based violence, we would be remiss if we didn't include this region, because it provides one of the most poignant examples of what happens when justice and infrastructure remain out of reach and repeatedly fail. So though there has been an increasing focus on violence in this region, like so many other things, we once again overlook the gendered realities, the gendered context of violence, as well as other crises that affect this region. And as many of us know, so often in crises and conflict, it's women and children who shoulder the burden of that. This region also demonstrates, that we can't just check a box and say, well, we've got a law on the books, the legislation has been carried through its processes, and so let's move on to the next problem. But I think it demonstrates that really the value of these laws only just begins when they're put on the books. And it's really the enforcement and the integrity and the engagement across all levels of society that really makes a difference. And I say that because all 3 of the countries within the Northern Triangle, so that's El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, have pretty significant legislation and statutes within the rule of law. Everything from, the issue of domestic violence to informal and forced marriages to issues of sexual assault and femicide. But 95% of crimes against women and girls in this region go unpunished. And so I think that is a very glaring example of, we can't just clap our hands and say, well, the law's on the books, everything's great. And that's really important to note because as we've seen across the challenges we face here in the United States on our southern border, this has implications not just for the region of Central America, but it has a strong ripple effect on broader stability and security worldwide. For women and girls who face violence in these regions, they often have 3 choices. One is they can stay and continue to endure violence. And as we all know, violence exists across the spectrum. So one day it may be harassment, but it can and often does steadily increase all the way to the forms of sexual assault to femicide. They can report, but many times in this region, we have seen women are not believed. They experience serious bias and prejudice in reporting, and the lack of follow through across every step within the justice system really, I think, inhibits the willingness of women to come forward. In El Salvador, 2/3 of women have been the victims of violence, but only 6% have come forward to report because they know it's a bit of a futile effort. And lastly, they face the option of fleeing, seeking safety elsewhere. And that in and of itself comes with a very significant risk of further re-victimization along the journey, whether they are migrating internally or they are migrating to other regions like along our US southern border. And so these are things that we really need to give greater consideration to, not just in terms of, our policies in the United States and other international actors who are looking at how do we strengthen security and stability across the region, but also how we think about our own immigration policy here in the United States. And both in the development context as well as in the immigration policy context, we give a lot of lip service to the topic of gender-based violence. But again, when you peel back the layers and look for actual action and what this means, there's not a lot there. And so there's a real opportunity for us to move forward and to get to progress. And you specifically asked about the asylum process. For women who are fleeing violence from this region, who also often experience violence in their journey here. 60% of asylum seekers who were surveyed by the United Nations reported that violence was the driver of why they left. And as we know, based on more recent data, 60 to 80% of women who make the journey through Mexico experience additional instances of sexual assault. But then when they get to our southern border and pursue the only legal pathway to safety that's afforded to them, which is our asylum process, and I want to reiterate, that is a legal pathway for immigration, they face the very concerning reality that gender is actually still not one of the categories of persecution recognized under refugee law. So after taking the enormous risk of trying to get to safety, they face the very real possibility that that safety will not be guaranteed to them, at least in the most basic manner in terms of their ability to migrate here to the United States. And that's not just true of women facing violence in Central America. This is very true as well of women who are fleeing violence in places like Afghanistan and elsewhere across the world. So it's incredibly complex. It's a huge opportunity for us to move forward really impactful policies. And the last thing I want to note here too is in this region of the world, especially, most of the victims of violence are adolescent girls and young women. And so this is a huge opportunity to support a really critical population that, again, has a ripple effect in fortifying security, stability, prosperity, peace, not just for this region, but for all of us across the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, Natalie. Obviously, you paint a very sobering notion of what is going on for Central American women, specifically from the Northern Triangle, and also in their journey to the United States. Thank you. Hari, I'm gonna turn to you. And in India, in addition to the sexual violence and domestic abuse women face globally, women in India face two additional challenges. The first one is marriage-related violence, including dowry, honor killings, and forced child marriages. And a second one is violence related to caste or religion, right? Especially when it comes to lower castes. Can you tell us how this affects how India balances or not tradition with gender-based violence?
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and also for bringing us all together. Unfortunately, this is a global issue. And as we can see with this panel, we have people from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, and from the Americas, So it is very much a global issue. And I think in India's case, just as Natalie also just spoke right now, she said that 6% of people report violence in Central America. Even in India, that number is really low. According to some data points, about 1 to 2%, and even for those 1 to 2%, you have issues like what you just mentioned of caste, of marriage-related violence. And a lot of this has to do with a historical culture, that includes things like the fire test for Sita in the Ramayana to prove that she's pure. And we had things like Sati, where if a woman's husband dies, then she also has to, put herself on top of the husband's funeral pyre. So we have a lot of this that goes back thousands of years, right? Not only a few hundred years, but Sati goes back almost a whole millennia, more than that. So it's very difficult in that sense, despite having legislation, which is also something that two of the people here just spoke about, Ariella and Natalie, that just having the legislation is not enough. So in India, there were two cases of rape, one in 1972 called the Mathura rape case, where a tribal girl was raped by two policemen inside a police station in 1972. And, there was a lot of protest and a lot of public movement after this. And after this, India introduced things like custodial rape, where specific punishment for custodial rape, where If a woman is under the custody of the police, under the custody of armed forces, medical institutions, there is a much higher sentence that is given to the people in case they are prosecuted at the end of it. But, you know, to be honest, despite all the legislation that has been passed, even after the 2013 rape case, 2012 rape case, Nirbhaya, in 2013, India passed the criminal law ordinance, which introduced fast track court for rapes. It introduced a lot of recommendations from the Justice Verma Committee. And unfortunately, though, you know, this is not enough in India to sort of combat gender-based violence, because as much as you introduce legislation, you need a cultural movement in India that runs parallel to the legal aspect of things. So you need that cultural movement in India to give women more dignity, despite the progress that we have had, whatever little progress we have had from the legal point of view.
Thank you, Hari. So we do need to change the way that women in India and men, but especially women, from what you're saying, to look at gender-based violence as a human rights problem and one that is theirs.
Yeah, and culturally, you know, I find it really difficult for India to move forward unless there is something that changes the way men view women and the way the place women have in society in India. Just to give you an example, only about 18 to 20% of women in India currently work. So the female labor participation rate in India is amongst the lowest it has ever been in independent India's history. It's lower than it was in 1947, the percentage. So when you have only 18% of women working in India, it's really difficult to be able to implement these things. And of course, a lot of this is just because culturally, women are not given the opportunities that they need to be given and are not treated equally to, you know, get the kind of jobs that that India in fact needs.
Correct. Okay. Thank you, Hari. And Mushira, I'm gonna turn to you. In your piece, you highlight how COVID-19 highlighted weaknesses and shattered institutions and laws that criminalize gender-based violence. But also you highlight Egypt's case with the national strategy to promote human rights. What paved the way for this? What happened in Egypt that the COVID pandemic actually became not a success story per se, but a positive note when it came to promoting women's rights?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's always great to join the Wilson Center in your great activities, and I'm proud to be one of your alumni. It's a very happy coincidence that I can announce that the Parliament has nominated my candidature as the president of Egypt's National Human Rights Council. And today, the President of the Republic endorsed the decision by the Parliament. So as we speak, I am officially the President of Egypt's National Human Rights Council, the first female president. The council is established according to the Paris Principles. This is a resolution by the UN General Assembly, and it's category A. So I am really very honored to be in this situation, following the footsteps of Dr. Boutros Ghali, the former UN Secretary General, and my mentor. He was my university professor and my Minister of Foreign Affairs. And this can give you an idea about the leap that women have succeeded in achieving. I can tell you that now there is no field closed before women in the public sphere. There is no profession that cannot take women. The last two bastions of resistance was in the judiciary, or were in the judiciary, the prosecution general and the state council, the administrative courts. Both were adamantly refusing to admit women, and this has been beaten, and now we have hundreds of female judges all over the judiciary. We have constitutional rights now, and we have managed really to make a leapfrog. Having said this, domestic violence is a different story. And I'm surprised that we are in the same place like Russia. But why domestic violence remains elusive? It's because of the stigma. And victims of domestic violence do not report. Like you mentioned, the case of COVID-19 in Egypt was a success story. There was good coordination inside the government, and we managed to sail through with reasonable losses, human, economic, so on and so forth. It was okay, we managed. GDP rise was lower than usual, but we are picking up. Hopefully, Omicron will not reverse this state. And like I wrote, domestic violence increased because of COVID lockdown. The whole family was cramped in a small place. I'm talking about poorer households. And women had only not to cook and serve and clean for the entire family, but also some women couldn't go back to school, to work. They lost their jobs, and women had to work as nurses for the sick in the family. And I'm talking about the poorer households, because when you go to the higher, they didn't suffer because of COVID-19. There was not violence, domestic violence. To the contrary, it was an opportunity for the family to get together. Men helped with home affairs. We had good stories, but the suffering was the lower. Children from poorer family did not have connectivity to reach their education virtually. But overall, I think women emerged winners. And now in the national response to COVID-19, women feature very high because, as I wrote in my piece, the strategy for human rights has allocated an entire section for women's rights, which I don't agree with, because usually we divide rights to civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. This strategy divided rights to three, the two typical, and then the third, it put women, children, and the disabled. Fine, this shows you that there is a hype for women's rights. And without being, without exaggerating, if you can single out one success story in Egypt, it's women's rights and how they managed. Women activism was very well coordinated, and they really were careful negotiators in the new system, in the new republic. They coordinated their efforts, and they had very good political support at the higher echelon of the state. And now the society is more aware of the contribution. This is not only in Egypt, like I wrote, Tunisia, Algeria. And of course, in the region, we have sad stories because the war in Yemen, uncertainties in Libya, Syria, Iraq, these are, and Palestine, these are, the mood in the region is not a great one because of political conflicts and instability, and of course the climate change, and for us the water we have a serious threat because of the Renaissance Great Dam and the rights to water. But overall, I think women have fared very well. And I think that there will be no going back, because we are heading towards a huge battle over the civil status law. This is really the real test, whether women will be able to parallel the rights they achieved in the public sphere with the rights they achieve in the family. Religious institutions are pushing back, but women activism is more powerful, supported by political leadership. So keep an eye on Egyptian women, what they will do with the personal status law, because this will be a very heated battle. But we have also breakthrough, like I wrote, female genital mutilation, this silent cancer. For the first time, Shobra Criminal Court sentenced a father, this is unprecedented, sentenced a member of the family to prison, and the nurse who committed FGM. And this is the criminal court. There is no going back on this. So this is a breakthrough in the private sphere. Now the message will go to every father or mother who decides to cut her girl or to push her into unwanted early marriage, that they can go to court. So I think we are winning. The curve is going up, but we have to remain vigilant.
Thank you, Mushira. Well, first of all, congratulations on your appointment. We're very happy that this is happening as we speak, and we'll certainly be keeping an eye out for Egyptian women. You're very, very right. So we're gonna go to the second round of this discussion, where we're gonna talk about the institutions in each of our countries, right? And I wanna start this round with Natalie, because you just mentioned in your remarks that women in Central America, specifically in the Northern Triangle countries, have three choices, right? They can report and face disbelief, they can stay and risk additional violence, or they can flee. You mentioned that though there's an increasing focus in the US and the international community on the levels of violence in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and the impact this has on migration, an adequate response to the gender differences in ways violence is perpetrated remains very limited to non-existent. How can institutions, how can the international community contribute to strength and these institutions and the rule of law?
So I would be remiss if I didn't use this opportunity with this question to call out the advocates on the ground and the strength of civil society movements in the region. You know, there are incredible nonprofits, NGOs, and individuals who've been really pushing hard. And this is tough stuff. I mean, again, there's that spectrum of violence that exists, and you know, it covers everything from harassment and other forms of control, all the way through to instances of trafficking and femicide. And these groups do this hard work day in and day out. And I want to go back to something that Hari said in terms of what's going on in India. That's, you know, it paralleled here in Central America. Frankly, it's true everywhere. You know, what I appreciate about the civil society organizations pushing really hard is that they're pushing both on the systems as well as the social structures in tandem. And to get to progress, you really need to do both. And that's why I see greater investments in these civil society actors is really critical, not only to strengthening rule of law, but ensuring that the broader social determinants of well-being, the broader gender bias that persists within society is addressed. You know, there are organizations who are meeting people where they are, and that's not just, you know, women in urban populations, but really thinking about the challenges that are faced across all the, you know, differences and intersectionalities that make communities who they are. So just to cite a few really fantastic examples, there are folks like Glasswing International Justice Mission, the IRC, who've been doing a wonderful job, for example, in Indigenous and rural populations, educating something so basic, but educating women of their rights and agency and what is actually protected under the law. That's huge because a lot of women don't realize, what it means to not only have agency, but to act on that agency, to have choices, and to be able to carry through with those choices. Glasswing International does a fantastic job of engaging youth populations, not just women, but men as well. And I know that came up in the conversation earlier. We're not going to get to progress on gender-based violence or gender equity generally if we don't adequately engage men and boys. I mean, this is about progress for all of us. And when you look at who, the perpetrators of violence traditionally are in this region, they're often, as they are in most places, the people, the men who are closest to the survivors and victims of violence. And so to engage men and boys really early on to move towards progress. And organizations like Promundo and the Spouses of CARICOM Leaders group, which is comprised of First Ladies, are doing a wonderful job, not just of educating men and boys about the realities of gender-based violence, but engaging them as critical partners in getting to progress. I also think it's really important that we call out the data gaps that continuously persist, not just in terms of looking at incidences of violence in this region, but also, the realities and experiences of those who are seeking refuge, who are seeking asylum on our southern border. InfoSeguro is a fantastic initiative through UNDP that's funded by USAID that looks at incidences of violence across 7 countries in the region. And without the incredible work they have undertaken, we really would have a very limited view of what GBV looks like in these regions. You cannot address a problem if you don't understand at the most basic level the scope of that problem. And so what InfoSeguro is doing is really, really incredible to getting to solutions. And, these civil society organizations can't do it all. And this is really where public-private partnerships are going to be critical, not just in terms of public sector institutions within these countries, but also the private sector. The private sector can be a real catalyst for change here. We've seen it in this region, especially around issues like labor rights. And so, greater engagement of the private sector is going to be really, really critical. And I don't think a lot of people think about that when they think of rule of law and justice systems, and most often look to sort of the traditional actors within those institutions. But much like any other issue that persists, change happens when we break down silos and work together. And so, private sector engagement, the role of civil society especially, I think, is where we really need to stack our chips for the future, because that's where progress in this region really rests.
Thank you, Natalie. Absolutely. And Hari, I'm gonna turn to you. We have a little over 18 minutes left. And you mentioned that, participation of women in India is an issue. Right now, for example, in India's legislative body, there's 543 seats, but of those, only 79 are held by women. And India's female force, as you rightly mentioned, hit a record low of only 17.5%, right, in 2017. Women in politics in India, do you think that can make a difference?
Thanks, Beatrice. So a couple of things, as I mentioned, the cultural aspect in India is always going to be quite important. And one thing that Ms. Mushira Khattab just now mentioned is that women in Egypt have started becoming a more active part of the judiciary. That has not yet happened, for instance, in India as much. Yeah, we need more women police officers in India. We need women who can actually, make sure that they are part of. Right now, in a lot of states in India, you have special cells for women and children in the police stations, right? So we need a lot of change that has to be done there. But to be honest, I'm a little wary because you have simple things that have not yet happened. So IPC section 375, for instance, in India says that marital rape is not a criminal offense. Yeah, so marital rape is not even considered a criminal offense in India today. And these traditional gender roles really need to be questioned, and they need to change. Yeah. So a couple of things have happened in the judiciary and in the police system, some reforms that have helped. So for instance, today, a police officer is mandated to register complaints of sexual assault, and failure to do so for that police officer can result in 2 years jail time. Yeah. Still, even despite having these laws, you still have some reluctance when you have someone of a lower caste who goes to a police station to file such complaints. But a few other things also have happened that are quite positive. So one thing, for instance, there are police helplines across the country. Every single state has a different helpline for gender-based violence. You also have a sex offenders database in India that is being, I think it was launched in 2018, and it is slowly being built up, and the law enforcement agencies have access to that. One other thing is also that domestic violence, as Ariella had mentioned earlier, about 2/3 of men in India, according to the latest survey in 2019, said that it is justified for men to beat their partners, their spouses. Yeah. And as a result of this, in 2005 or so, India had passed the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. And under that, any woman can file a civil complaint. And the advantage with that is there are a lot of obstacles for women to file criminal complaints in a police station. There's a lot of scrutiny, there's a lot of stigma, and filing a civil complaint happens to be a little easier in that sense. So things like that, help, because these are catered very specifically to India. These may work more in India than they do in other places because of the cultural factors. But we still need a lot of gender sensitivity training, specifically amongst lawyers, amongst the judiciary, in the police force as well. And of course, you need a lot of educational campaigns, awareness campaigns. I'll just give one example of something I thought was quite interesting. There's an organization called Breakthrough that works on violence against women in India. And they had a campaign called Bell Bajao, which is a Hindi term, but it basically means ring the doorbell. And that campaign went all over the country. And basically what they said was, whenever you hear instances of domestic violence, because a lot of times you can actually hear it, right? Even though it's right next to your house. And especially in India, in cities in India where you have such dense populations, right? So the campaign ran all over television and was promoted online as well. And basically said, if you hear any instances of domestic violence, go ring the doorbell. You don't even have to confront the person if you don't want to, if you don't feel comfortable doing so. But go ring the doorbell every time it happens. And they know then that they're doing something wrong, and that other people know that this is wrong. Yeah. So like this, you need very specific things that cater to your own population. So in India, this kind of campaign worked to bring about some awareness. I just want to
That's great, Hari.
finish saying one thing, a quote from Neelam Dev, who's a former Indian ambassador. She had said that any positive change in India in terms of legislation is to be welcomed, but no change is to be thought of as enough.
That's a great quote, Hari. Thank you so much. Mushir, I'm gonna pass on to you. And you led efforts in Egypt to make female genital mutilation a crime punishable by law, right? How is this possible, considering that this practice was a complex social and cultural trait what happened and how did the political, economic, and cultural value systems changed for this to be possible?
Thank you for putting this question to me. Actually, it was a societal movement. I was able to galvanize the society at the grassroots level, because it's easy to go into a fancy hotel and make a conference and say whatever you want. And at the same time, very difficult to go at very dark places where they practice this underground and raise your voice and say, don't do FGM. You cannot. It was a taboo. Nobody could even utter, and everything was happening underground. But when you reach out to the grassroots, explain to them and ask them, why do you do this? And they will tell you their fears, that the girl will not be married, that it will raise her esteem with her husband, it will do her well, her health well, and then you prove the contrary. And you mobilize the religious leaders. You have to pick the moderate ones. You will find those who are not willing to join you, but you choose enlightened religious leaders at the grassroots level and members of the parliament, people, influencers at the local level. And they have to feel, the families has to feel supported by the entire community to say no to this practice. The role of men was very crucial. Young men stood up and talked about the harmful impact of FGM and that they don't want to marry a circumcised girl. This made a shift. We encourage them to go to stage and speak to everybody about their grievances, how they suffer from FGM, not only the woman, but the husband and the children. And you hear testimonials from the many people in the village. And we end up by making a village declaration. In a tent, you have about 10,000 people from the local community. They come, make testimonials, and they sign a commitment. We will not do FGM. And then everybody celebrates, and they are rewarded by establishing a health center, women-friendly health center, by paving some roads, building new schools. So they feel that the society is celebrating their achievement. And this has become contagious from one village to the other. And only through this, we could go to the parliament and ask for the criminalization. And it was done with the support of the grassroots. And this is how in 2012, when the religious groups took control of Egypt, the civil society stood to the attempts to nullify this law. They said no, because they know that this is the law that they themselves made. Until now, this law is intact. Not only that, the penalty is harshened, and the penalty is harshened. At the same time, there is ongoing capacity building programs for the practitioners, for law enforcement, for the judiciary, for grassroots organizations. And this is how you keep the momentum and reward the leaders of change, because these are the courageous people who faced their local community and they said, we will do it. The media played a very important part to support. And they really, I'm happy to see that now a case of FGM goes to the criminal court for the first time.
That's
and
great,
to
Mushira.
to penalize the father. This will send a message to parents that you're not immune simply because you are the parents or simply because it happened underground. You are going to go before court.
Okay. Wow, that's a fantastic way to do it. Mariana, I want to touch base with you and mention that Russia did not sign the Istanbul Convention in 2011, but in 2016, domestic violence legislation entered the State Duma, and you say that Russian society was well prepared, alert, and divided. Is the Duma the place where change is happening, or is it a grassroots movement like it is in Egypt?
I mean, it's
Mariana.
both, of course. You can't really separate. Great. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
And can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. So, of course, and the official institutions who make change happen, and the relationship between that and anything else, international sort of initiatives end up in the past 10 years being rebuffed by the Russian government within the framework of cultural sovereignty. And it also creates this illusion that Russia is this very strange country where women are oppressed, you know, nothing's happening, patriarchy, Putin, blah, blah, blah. But I would like to remind you that actually Russian women have a very strong presence in official institutions. Just to give you some numbers, 66% of all Russian judges are women. So you can imagine that it is not the problem with the judiciary that anything's happening. Russian women are more educated than men. There are professions in which Russian women dominate. For example, the majority of teachers are women. There is a glass ceiling, of course, but just to compare, say, with Finland, where I work, in Russia, the 30% of all full professorships, actually 35% of all full professorships are women. In Finland, it's only 12. And Finland is the leading country in gender equality, right? But not apparently in higher education. But then the paradox is that you have this really strong presence of women in all the official institutions, and yet a reluctance of those official institutions to introduce gender-sensitive legislation, such as, for example, a separate special law on domestic violence or a separate special law on human rights of women. Well, I theorize a lot about it, and I think actually I agree with Natalie in a sense that you can have a beautiful legislation, you can have all the legislation you need on domestic violence, and yet you can have domestic violence in a very high ratio. And again, Finland is my favorite example, because actually Finland has all this legislation, but the highest rate of domestic violence in Europe, not just in the Nordic countries, but in Europe. And this is the country we always take as a model of gender equality. And as you probably heard, that Finland has actually all-female government, so that all our parties are led by women these days, and we have a youngest prime minister who is a female, and a government that is the majority of women in government, of people in government are women. So, but yet we have and it's getting higher and higher. And Finland, for example, is the country that sterilized transgender people, so you cannot actually change your gender and go through operation unless you are sterilized. Well, Russia doesn't have that. So Russia actually does. You can do your gender change without sterilization. You can basically so go and get new documents and blah blah blah. And that is again a paradox. Poland doesn't do that. And again, Poland has a policy on abortion, for example. So so the question is both theoretical and practical. What is the better route to actually have gender-sensitive legislation and that legislation being official, or to have stronger institutions and strategies to combat domestic violence? Of course, ideally, you'd have both, right? So very strong legislation, the explicit legislation, and then strong institutions, and especially civil society working together with the official institutions to do that. But unfortunately, what happens is that politics interferes, and politics interferes quite a lot. We keep forgetting that a lot of this legislation, domestic violence legislation, for example, is very pragmatic. And that's what Russia is. And Russia is a very good example of a very pragmatic, down-to-earth approach to legislation. And down-to-earth approach is, why do we need all the additional legislation? Just because we have to satisfy Europe or international community if it doesn't work? Now, the other thing we keep forgetting, and I think nobody has mentioned it so far in the discussion, although Natalie actually talked about it, is that actually human rights of women and domestic violence and actually combating violence is a very expensive endeavor. And being a very expensive endeavor, you have to be very prepared to fund legislation. Now, in Russia, what happens when you actually come up with the bill in a state, do a budget for that. And if you don't, the whole discussion about it, on what money we're going to actually create all these shelters, all these initiatives, and blah, blah, blah. So in a sense, you can see that this is a much more problematic area than just passing the law. We've done a lot of passing the laws. Come on, Russia was the first country that actually criminalized domestic violence in 1845. Before anyone, but it doesn't work. It just doesn't work because you don't have the, the pragmatic strategy and financial commitment to do that. And so Russians are very pragmatic about it. If we don't have the money, why do we need a law for that? That doesn't mean, though, that civil society or institutions on the ground actually don't work with that. But it is something which is rarely talked about by international media or by anyone else. And then what we always keep saying, and I'm sorry to be a little bit over time with this positive thing, that please come look at our research. We always sort of show that communities on the ground, that civil society, and a lot of them, they're actually very present, and they can also show you that they're actually working to improve the situation with dealing with domestic violence and violence against women in general.
Thank you, Mariana. We've run out of time. This was a fantastic panel. I want to encourage everybody to visit our publication that's live at the Wilson Center page. It's Pathways to Justice, Gender-Based Violence and the Rule of Law. Thank you so much, Natalie, Ariela, Mariana, Mushira, Hari. This was fantastic. Until next time.
Yeah, thanks very much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.